Well, good morning. It's great to be here together as church family as we continue this sermon series looking at Sabbath. And this morning, as Vicky said, we are continuing with what the Sabbath means for our lives. And we've talked about Sabbath as stopping a couple of weeks ago. Last week, we heard about Sabbath as resting. And this week, I have the joy of looking at Sabbath as delight. And we've just heard these words of Jesus in John chapter 15 as he encourages us to remain in him, to follow his commands, of which Sabbath keeping is one. And in verse 11, we have this major reason why. And I'm just going to read it again. I have told you this, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. The reason, one of the major reasons why Jesus gives us his commandments is not that we might discover a life of drudgery, but of delight. That is why we're called to follow in God's commands. And as we begin this morning, I want to invite you to have a little look at the screens.
Scandals happen all the time. The question is, how do democracies respond to those scandals?
And what will it mean for the wider region? I think one of your children has just walked in. I mean, shifting sands in the region. Do you think relations with the North may change?
I would be surprised if they do. Pardon me. My apologies.
What's this going to mean for the region?
My apologies. South Korea's policy choices on North Korea have been severely limited in the last 6 months to a year.
There we go. This little clip went viral in 2017, and my reason for showing it this morning, apart from the fact it makes me feel loads better about my parenting disasters, and hopefully anyone with young children here this morning, you can share in that. None of mine have gone viral just yet, is because I wonder if this idea of Sabbath can at times feel a little bit like the intrusion of these children into that serious BBC News interview. Here we are getting on with our busy, important lives, and then we're given this command to take a break from it all, to get off the hamster wheel, as Tom put it a couple of weeks ago. Now, maybe that sounds great, but maybe it feels a little bit jarring. And if that's the case, then maybe today's idea of Sabbath, not only as stopping and resting, but also as delighting, feels a step too far. Like those children skipping and scooting through the door into the middle of that serious interview. It feels out of place and intrusive rather than an invited presence into our weeks. But Sabbath is about delight. Jesus himself said plainly, in this world you will have trouble. But he also said his desire for his disciples, for us, was that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. Sorrow, as we know well, is inevitable in this life, but joy is not. And in the way of Jesus, joy is a gift, but it's one that must be chosen and cultivated day after day as we seek to become more like our joyful God. And this is where I want us to kick off this morning by noticing that the God we worship is a God of joy and delight. He's not boring, standoffish, a distant deity. No. Our God is a God of abundant joy. Right back at the start of the story in Genesis chapter 1, we read how God made the world in 6 days, but on the 7th day he rested. And the reason why God rested wasn't because he was exhausted. In Isaiah chapter 40, we read these words, "The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired and weary." God's Sabbath rest wasn't a result of burnout, but because he wanted to take joy and delight in all that he had made. In the New Testament, we continue to meet with a God who loves to celebrate. We hear Jesus tell stories of a dad who throws a welcome home party for his son. We read about how he feasted with the down and outs and the people everybody else rejected. We read how he partied with newlyweds. The God we worship is a God who loves a party. He's a God of abundant life and joy. He doesn't see delight as an intrusion or an interruption that kind of stands in the way of the more important things of life. No. He embraces and embodies joy and celebration, and he invites us to share in his joy. And one of the ways we can do this is by having a Sabbath, by stopping, resting and delighting in all that he has made. Sabbath is a way that we can know and experience the joy and delight of our God. A few years ago, after I graduated from university, I had the joy of traveling with my friend for a little while, a few months, and one of the places we went was New Zealand. And when we were there, we had the privilege of being invited to do this one-day walk, which in the North Island was described as one of the best one-day walks in New Zealand. If you've ever seen pictures of New Zealand or have ever had the privilege of going to New Zealand, then you'll know that it is a stunning country. And so for this walk to be billed as one of the best in this beautiful place, we thought it's probably going to be good. So we signed ourselves up, and we didn't really have the right kit. We hadn't anticipated doing a major hike when we were there, but this was an opportunity we couldn't turn down. So on the day of the walk, we got up ridiculously early, we hopped on the bus, and we drove to where our guide was waiting. But the reality was, it was pretty dark. The sun had barely come up. It was cold. It was misty, and it was very clear that we didn't have the right shoes on. So far, not so good. But we were committed. We had done this thing. We were going to continue. And so we followed our guide and the others that were with us. And I will never forget that as time went by, the sun rose, as that mist began to lift over the mountain in front of us, which for any Lord of the Rings fans here was in fact Mount Doom. I cannot begin to pronounce its actual name. But as the sun rose over this stunning scenery, everything else faded away. And it was indeed the most beautiful walk that I've ever done. All the effort to get there and make it happen was worth it. And we discovered when we got back just how fortunate we'd been to do it, because for days before and days after, no one else had been able to do the Tongariro crossing, which is what we had been able to do that day. And I think sometimes Sabbath-Delight can feel a little bit like that. It can feel like hard work. It can feel like maybe we don't have the right metaphorical kit, as it were, to do it. Maybe we're in the midst of the busyness, the seriousness, even the sorrow of our lives. We've forgotten how to delight. Perhaps it feels countercultural, like me and my friend as we stepped out the youth hostel, leaving everybody in our dorm in their beds, and we stepped out into that cold, dark morning. We wondered what on earth we'd done. But I want us to begin to see this morning that Sabbath is a precious gift to us. Just like going on that walk enabled us to see the most stunning scenery I have ever set eyes on. So, Sabbath is a way we can come to know and experience the joy and delight of the God that we worship. And unlike our walk, it's not something we can do once in a blue moon if the conditions are right, if the weather is perfect. No, we are invited week in, week out, whatever the circumstance and situation we're facing, to participate. John Mark Comer, who is the pastor of Bridgetown Church in the States, where this kind of thinking around Sabbath has come from, has these amazing words to say about Sabbath-Delight. The Sabbath comes every 7 days to remind us of the goodness of our life with God in all seasons of our lives, including the ones that don't feel very good. Unlike other spiritual disciplines, the timing of Sabbath is set by God himself, not by our own inner spiritual clock that tells us the need of the hour. Sabbath comes at the end of a great week and at the end of a lousy one, when we've finished our to-do lists and we're woefully behind. In summer and in winter, when all is well and when all is falling apart. To remind us that it's okay that we're not okay. In those seasons of the dark night where our prayers are unanswered, our dreams over, when we feel God's absence more than his presence, the Sabbath comes, and with it a sense of peace, of trust in God despite our circumstances, not because of them. Teaching us to delight and be happy in all the seasons of our life, or as Paul puts it, to rejoice in the Lord always. And I love this. I love this, how kind God is that he gives us this command to stop, to delight. I often think of commands as things that restrict me, that inhibit what I can do. But this is an invitation to life in all its fullness. It gives us permission every week to take a step back and focus, even for a little while, on those things that bring us joy and delight. What's not to like about it? So this morning, what delights your heart? What brings you joy? Doesn't have to be anything extravagant or expensive. And yet so often we miss out. Instead of embracing it with open arms, we try to dodge it, coming up with excuses for why it would never, ever work for us. Maybe we've turned Sabbath into some dull, dry religious ritual, something to be dreaded rather than delighted in. Maybe you can relate to some of these excuses. I know that I can. It's not realistic, and there is no point making myself miserable by acknowledging what I can't do. How can I dream of delight when I'm really struggling? I am so exhausted, I cannot even remember what brings me delight, and to think of it exhausts me more, so I'm actually not going to bother. It simply doesn't work in this stage of life. Do you know what it's like to have a 2-year-old? And my answer this morning would be yes. I do, and I get it. And for any parents of young children here this morning, when I saw what I would be preaching on this morning, I thought that the team were having a laugh. Sabbath-Delight. Let's give that to Ellie while she's on mat leave with a toddler and a baby. Woohoo! And I thought, what on earth have I got to say? My dream Sabbath used to be cycling into the centre of Cambridge where we used to live, finding a really nice little kind of cosy coffee shop, curling up with a latte, a good book. Maybe it was going for a run along the Cam. Maybe it was sitting in my flat, having a nice quiet time. Now, sofas are for decorative purposes only. Wonder if anybody else can relate to that. And my quiet time happens not to, spiritual worship music or peace and quiet of my flat, but to the tune of Postman Pat's special delivery service. That is where we're at in the Huggins house. But what I'm coming to realize is that God's invitation to Sabbath is for every one of us. God counts everybody in. This is for each of us. And so there must be a way for this to work, whatever season or circumstances we find ourselves in. And it's not because he hates us and wants to make us miserable, but because he loves us and wants us to know life in abundance. And so I want to encourage us, as I have tried to encourage myself over these last few weeks, to start somewhere. There's always a reason not to. There's always something else to do. And yes, Sabbath-Delight will look different in different seasons. But the time for Sabbath is always now, never later. We need it, not primarily because we're stressed, exhausted, and overworked, but because we need to practice letting go of control, trusting God, and allowing his heart, which is for joy, to fill us up. And Sabbath is a way that we get to receive God's grace every single week. But like those children running into the room, it feels at times like an intrusion, a nuisance which interrupts, slows us down, and distracts us. Our culture is obsessed with productivity, with busyness, with achieving things, and delight and joy go against all of that. Often they're unproductive. It's not about achieving anything, but just having fun, doing those things that bring life to us. When I go for a walk, I like to go from A to B. I like to have a plan. This is where we're going. We're just gonna get there. But I've had to learn, and particularly been challenged in preparing this talk, to go at the pace of a toddler. Because when Joss goes for a walk, he doesn't want to go from A to B. He wants to pick up stones. He wants to pick up sticks. He wants to put them in his pockets. He wants to tread in every puddle. At the moment, it's a nightmare because he wants to pick every blackberry on the bush and eat it. And a walk takes forever. There's no such thing as going from A to B. But Sabbath gives us permission each week to go at the pace of a child and delight in the world around us. Sabbath gives us permission every single week to go at the pace of a child and delight in the world around us. And that's what God longs for us, to experience deep, profound joy and delight. It's not an intrusion. It's not a distraction. It's how we were designed. And if our Creator delighted, then so can we. So how might we actually do this? How might this actually work itself out in our lives? Got a few suggestions. These are very much suggestions, not rules. But the first thing is to think about that question I asked earlier. What brings you delight? And have some fun thinking about that this week. Take time to ask God, what really brings you joy? I'm not talking about just scrolling through social media or vegging out because we can't think about what does bring us joy, but try and set some time aside to think what actually gives you life. And we're all different. What brings delight to me probably won't for you, and vice versa. But don't make the mistake that what you do on a Sabbath has to be super spiritual and holy, Bible reading, prayer, worship music. God is a part of everything we do, and we can share his delight as we do those things. John Mark Comer has a list of what, a sort of helpful list really of what we might do on a Sabbath, and I've just popped it up on the screen. There's going to be loads more things that aren't on that, but maybe that's a start of a 10 in terms of how we might begin to think about what we might do on our Sabbath. What is it that gives you life? Be as creative and thoughtful as possible. Secondly, do it in community. Do it in community. In some way, try and do it with one another together. And that might look like being with others, or it might mean knowing that others are doing Sabbath at the same time as you are. Today is the second of our life group sign-up Sundays. And maybe as a life group, you want to commit to sort of having Sabbath together, sharing ideas of what you might do that is life-giving. Maybe if you've got small children, you want to think about how maybe you could share that together, whether that's all having a day of having Sabbath together, the kids playing. Maybe it's a chance to do a bit of child swapping and have a chance to go for a coffee whilst others look after the kids and then swap it over. Whatever that might look like, think about how it might work in community. Have a Sabbath box. This was mentioned a couple of weeks ago, but something we're going to try and do is have a box where we put our phones, particularly those things that, just constantly are going off in our pockets and are just always there to have a quick scroll, but that doesn't really bring me life. So maybe have somewhere we can put that. And maybe in that box, if you're feeling stressed as you approach Sabbath, as you're feeling anxious or worried about things, write them down and pop them in that box. Not that that box is going to magically make them go away. Of course it's not. But as a kind of act of faith of saying, God, I'm trusting this into your hands. I commit it into you. You might want to kick it off with a meal. A friend of mine starts her Sabbath the night before, and she will always have a meal with friends. And she said she's found that to be a really life-giving thing in a way that they can commit together to delighting in their Sabbath. But I think the most important thing of all, and this is where I want to finish, is that we must start where we can. If it feels impossible for whatever reason, Start where you can. Don't beat yourself up if you find this hard. Anything is better than nothing. It's a lie that it will be easier later. I'll be able to do it when, because that will never come. The time for Sabbath is now. The time for Sabbath is now. What might it look like for you? Perhaps like those kids running into that screen, the idea of Sabbath-Delight feels more like an intrusion than a joy. But just imagine the impact if we started to live this out. Just imagine the impact if we had a moment in our weeks where we did what brought us life, where we let that fill us and then send us out into our workplaces, our families, our friendship groups. What impact it would have and what it would say about the God who calls us to it. I'm going to invite the band up now, and as they come, I want to give a couple of moments just for us to think right now about what gives us life. As I've said, the time is now. So let's make the most of this moment we've got here to ask the Lord what those things might be. We can continue to focus on it in the week, but let's just give some time now. Why don't we stand where we are if you're able to?